Hi guys! Tonight we're wandering into the snow. Not the snow you know, not the cheerful glittering kind that falls over cities and carols, but the old snow. The kind that came before electric lights. The kind that covered everything in silence. It's the 16th century. Somewhere deep in the Alps the world is sleeping under ice. A few yellow lights glow from cabin windows, but beyond them, only dark forests thick with frost and rumour. It is winter, and winter, back then, meant something different. When the sun began to vanish earlier each day, people wondered if it would come back at all. The world felt fragile, as if one wrong word could freeze it forever. So they lit their fires, they gathered together, and in the whisper of smoke they told stories. Stories of winter spirits, of watchers who walked when the snow fell deepest, of something ancient, not cruel, but powerful, that waited beyond the reach of the flame. Imagine standing in that cold, your breath misting in the air, your boots buried in drifts up to your knees. Somewhere, far away, a bell echoes. Not a church bell, a rough handmade one. It clangs twice, then fades into the forest. You know that bell. It belongs to the Krampus, the night when villagers dress as beasts and demons, marching through the dark to keep evil away. But tonight isn't about Krampus yet. Tonight is about what came before him, the feeling that the world itself was alive, that the snow could hear, that the trees could whisper. In these long Alpine nights, there was no rush. The world slowed down to a heartbeat. You could hear the creak of wood in the rafters, the hiss of logs, the sigh of the wind crawling around the doorframe. Inside, families huddled close, one candle, one pot of stew, one shared silence. The snow outside was heavy, muffling all sound, and in that quiet imagination filled the space where warmth ended. They said the darkness had a voice. It hummed through the pines, it moved through the valleys, and if you listened too long it began to speak. Some said it was the old ones, spirits that had lived in the mountains before people ever came. Others said it was just the wind. But everyone agreed on one thing. Winter wasn't empty. It was occupied. The villagers didn't think of the cold as lifeless. They saw it as sacred, a test, a presence. When the fire dimmed, they'd whisper little prayers to the spirits of warmth and light. They believed that as long as someone kept a flame alive, the darkness could never truly win. Children were told to behave, to keep the fire strong. Not because of punishment, but because the fire itself was a shield. If the flame went out, the cold things outside might notice. And in the crackle of the hearth, every hiss sounded like a whisper. Every creak in the floorboards felt like footsteps in the snow. But winter wasn't all fear. It was also beauty. The air smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. Icicles glimmered like crystal teeth from the eaves. The stars looked closer, brighter, like they were pressing down to see if the humans below would survive another season. And somehow, they always did. They made songs to honour the snow, dances to call back the sun, and feasts to celebrate warmth while they still had it. They believed that in the darkest night of the year, when the sun's path was shortest, the veil between worlds grew thin. That's when the spirits came out to play. You can almost hear it, a faint rhythm in the wind, a sound that isn't quite human. They said the perched and walked then, wild figures in masks, half beautiful, half horrifying. They weren't evil, they were reminders, life and death, light and dark, all part of the same winter. So they carved masks and danced under torchlight, trying to honour both sides of the season, the part that froze and the part that forgave. In these stories, winter had personality. It could be merciful, a blanket of snow that preserved the earth, or it could be vengeful, a storm that took the unprepared. But above all, it demanded respect. Because everything you had, food, light, warmth, time, could be taken overnight. When the last candle flickered, when the fire was only embers, they'd listen. Sometimes, they said, you could hear it. A single footstep outside, then another. Too slow to be an animal, too heavy to be the wind. You'd hold your breath. The snow would shift against the door, and then nothing. Just silence again. That silence wasn't empty. It was watching. It was the heart of the season, a reminder that even the dark was alive, ancient and waiting. And as villagers whispered their prayers to the light, the wind carried those words across valleys and forests to others doing the same. Small fires glowing against the endless white, 1,000 little stars of human warmth, because deep down they knew the cold wasn't the enemy. It was the test before the light returned. The snow is falling again, heavy, thick flakes that swallow every sound. It's the deep heart of winter, somewhere high in the Alps, where the mountains seem endless and the villages cling to their slopes like pockets of light against a sea of dark. You can almost feel it. The sharp sting of cold air in your lungs, the crunch of snow beneath your boots, the faint scent of pine smoke drifting down from chimneys. The year is drawing to a close. But before the light returns, before the sun finds its way back, something else comes first. In these frozen lands, people whisper about the one who walks with St. Nicholas. Not a saint, not an angel, but a shadow following in his wake. His name is Krampus. In every little Alpine town they tell the story differently. Some say Krampus is half demon, half goat, with horns that curve like blackened branches and fur the colour of midnight. Others say he's older than any god, a mountain spirit that refused to die when Christianity came. But all the stories agree on one thing. He comes when the nights are longest, when the snow is deepest, and when the line between this world and the next grows thin. The villagers believe the sound of chains in the snow means Krampus is near, not to steal, not to destroy, but to remind. Remind children to behave, remind adults to stay humble, remind everyone that kindness has weight and cruelty consequences. Because in the Alpine imagination, balance was everything. St. Nicholas rewarded good deeds, but someone had to see to the bad ones. That was Krampus's role, the counterweight to generosity. On the night before St. Nicholas's feast, people would prepare. Candles burned low. Children left out small offerings. A crust of bread, a few nuts, a cup of milk. They prayed the gift would satisfy the creature that prowled just outside their windows. Meanwhile, the men of the village were busy dressing in furs and horns. They fastened heavy bells around their waists, smeared ash on their faces, and took up wooden staffs wrapped in straw. Soon, a low chorus began to rumble through the valley. Not a song, but a growl echoing off the stone walls of the mountains. This was the Krampuslauf, the parade of Krampus. Through the streets, dozens of figures marched, monstrous, horned silhouettes illuminated by torchlight. They swung chains, stomped their boots, and rattled the bells strapped to their belts. Sparks flew from their torches and disappeared into the falling snow. Children hid behind shutters, peeking through cracks in the wood as the procession passed. The smell of smoke and sweat filled the air, and though everyone knew it was just the men of the village beneath those masks, there was always that one moment when doubt crept in. Because no matter how well you thought you recognized the eyes behind the horns, there was always one mask that looked too real, one pair of eyes that didn't blink, and when that one looked your way, even the bravest would step back. The Krampuslauf wasn't just about fear, it was a cleansing, a night to scare away evil spirits, to drive out the darkness that clung to the year. Each shout, each clang of the bell, each flicker of the flame was meant to chase away what couldn't be seen. And when dawn finally came, the villagers would sweep their doorways, clean their hearths, and hang fresh greenery, evergreen boughs, the promise of life returning. It was their way of saying, "We've faced the dark, now let the light come back." But where did Krampus come from? Some scholars believe he's far older than Christmas, older even than Christianity itself. His roots reach back into pre-Christian Alpine traditions, where the mountains were thought to be alive with spirits. Every valley, every forest, every frozen lake had a guardian. Some kind, some cruel, all demanding respect. Krampus may have once been one of those spirits, not a devil, but nature god of winter and fertility. When new faiths arrived, those gods had to change their shapes. The kind ones became saints, the wild ones became demons, but the people still remembered. So they let both exist, saint and monster, side by side, keeping the world in balance. In the centuries that followed, Krampus became both punishment and play. Parents would whisper his name to quiet, restless children. But on winter nights they'd also laugh as the Krampuslauf came through, because everyone knew the rule. If you laughed, if you faced him without fear, he'd pass you by. The festival became a strange mix of terror and joy. People drank, danced, and watched the horned figures march by, knowing they were taming something ancient with firelight and noise. And there's a beauty to that idea, that even fear could become ritual, that instead of hiding from their monsters, people danced with them. They invited them in, gave them shape, and then sent them away again. Krampus, in that way, wasn't evil. He was the keeper of balance, the one who reminded the village that darkness and light needed each other. Without the cold, warmth means nothing. Without fear, kindness loses its meaning. Picture the scene again. A small village under the full moon, snow drifting down like feathers, the fire in the square burning low, the Krampus figures fading back into the woods, bells echoing softly through the trees. You're left standing there, watching their torches vanish one by one. The air feels suddenly still, empty, but in a sacred way. The snow glows faintly in the starlight, and for a moment you wonder, were they just men in masks, or did something older walk among them that night, just for a little while? And when the bells stopped ringing, the snow swallowed their footprints. The torches have gone out, the sound of bells fades beyond the valley, and now winter deepens. The villagers whisper that this is when she begins to walk. Not Krampus, not the horned spirits, but someone older, someone with two faces, one beautiful, one terrible. Her name is Perchta. In the Alpine lands of Austria, Bavaria, and the Tyrol, they called her the Bright One. But her brightness wasn't gentle. It was the sharp light of the moon over snow, cold, flawless, and watching. They said she came during the 12 nights of winter, the days between Christmas and Epiphany, when time stood still and the boundaries between the worlds began to blur. the nights when families gathered by firelight, telling stories to keep her pleased and to keep her far away. Perchta wasn't a witch in the way we think of witches now. She was something much older, a remnant of the old goddesses of the north. Some said she was a daughter of Frigg or Holder, weaving the fate of mortals with icy fingers. Others said she was once a goddess of fertility and spinning, who turned fierce when people forgot her name. But all agreed, during those 12 nights, she returned, and she was watching. The women would whisper as they spun wool by the hearth, "Work hard, keep your house tidy, finish your spinning, for Perchta will come to see." To the diligent she brought small blessings, a coin left on the table, a loaf of bread that never grew stale, a dream that foretold spring. But to the lazy, the greedy, or the cruel, her reward was different. She would slip through the cracks in the door, her breath cold as moonlight. And if she found your spinning unfinished, or your heart ungrateful, she'd leave you with a reminder you'd never forget. In some villages they said she carried a knife of silver, sharper than any mortal blade. If she found a liar or a thief asleep, she'd open them from neck to navel, remove their insides and fill them with straw and stones. Then she'd sew them back up again, neat, careful, almost loving. The villagers didn't tell that story to scare their children. They told it to remind them that work, honesty and gratitude mattered more than fear. Because Perchta wasn't cruelty, she was balance, the cold side of kindness, the justice of winter. But she wasn't only feared. In some tales she was radiant, tall, golden-haired, dressed in white robes like sunlight on snow. When she appeared to the faithful, she brought blessings and peace. She was the spirit of order, protecting homes from the chaos of winter's spirits. Her followers, the Perchtan, took her name and made it their ritual. They dressed in masks and furs, much like the Krampus, but their purpose was different. They were her army, the beautiful and the ugly Perchtan. The beautiful Perchtan wore gleaming masks painted in gold and white, crowned with flowers. They represented light, fortune, and new beginnings. The ugly Perchtan wore twisted faces and horns, embodiments of darkness, disease, and hunger. Together they paraded through the snow, ringing bells, driving away evil, and restoring balance to the land. It was a dance between opposites, beauty and horror, kindness and wrath, summer and winter. The people believed that if both sides of Perchta were honoured, the year would turn in their favour. Inside the homes, mothers told their children, "Be kind, work well, keep the house clean, and Perchta will smile on you." Fathers would hang bits of spun flax by the window, offerings for her spirit. Bread and milk were placed on the table before bed, never cleared until morning, and when dawn came, if the bread was gone and only crumbs remained, the family would nod in silence. She had passed by. But if the offering was untouched, if the fire had burned too low, they'd relight it quickly, whispering prayers into the smoke. Because sometimes Perchta didn't pass by. Sometimes she stopped, and the next morning people would find footprints in the snow, bare, small, and perfectly shaped. Too small for any human foot, too light for the weight of the snow. They said her steps never left holes, only impressions of frost. Where she walked, the snow shimmered, like moonlight had melted and refrozen. She wasn't the only one who walked those nights. The Perchtan spirits followed her, wild shapes moving through fog and snow, Some looked human, others didn't. They carried torches and brooms, sweeping the air, purifying the paths before her. If you saw them, you were meant to bow your head and whisper her name. If you didn't, she might think you'd forgotten her, and in old belief, forgetting was the greatest sin, because to forget the old ways was to invite misfortune. As the centuries passed, Christianity tried to tame her. They called her a demon, a pagan relic, a witch, but the people kept her anyway. They gave her a new face, a new story, yet her essence stayed. Half saint, half spirit, half light, half shadow. To some she became a warning, to others a protector, to most she was both. Because that's how winter worked. It gave and it took, it blessed and it punished, it froze and it forgave. In one old tale, a young woman named Lisa lived at the edge of the forest. She worked hard, but she was lonely. Each night she spun wool until her fingers bled, praying for Perchta to see her effort and bless her. One night, when the snow fell thickest, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find a tall woman in a white cloak, her hair shining like ice. "You've worked well," the woman said. "Will you share your fire?" Lise nodded. The woman sat by the hearth, silent. When Lisa looked away, the stranger was gone, but in her place was a spool of golden thread. That spring, Lisa's crops grew twice as tall as before. The villagers said Perchta had rewarded her diligence, but they also said if Lisa had refused her fire, she might have vanished before dawn. So the people learned to respect both sides of the winter spirits. Krampus punished the wicked. Perchta judged the souls. The Perchtans swept the land clean of darkness. Each played a part in the rhythm of the season, the eternal heartbeat of winter. And when the 12th night passed, and the last candle burned low, they said she walked once more through the valley, one final time before the thaw. Her white cloak trailed over snow, and where it brushed, the ice began to melt, a sign that her work was done, and then she was gone. Only the faint scent of pine and frost remained. When you wake in the night, and the wind whispers your name, don't be afraid. It might just be her, checking her list of souls, making sure the world is still in balance. Perchta is watching. In the long frozen silence of the north, where nights last longer than dreams and the horizon glows blue with starlight, people once believed that the world was full of eyes. Eyes in the dark, eyes in the snow, eyes that watched from the forests, from the rafters, from the very wind that moved through the valleys. But these weren't always cruel eyes. Sometimes they were guardians, sometimes tricksters, sometimes something ancient and enormous that moved only when the last fire went out. These were the Yule beasts and spirits, the creatures of the north who walked when the candles burned low. In Iceland, where the snow lies thick over volcanic stone, they told of a creature that prowled the night before Christmas, an enormous black cat, with fur that shimmered like coal dust and eyes that burned like winter moons. They called it the Jólakötturinn, the Yule Cat. It wasn't a gentle creature. It wasn't evil either. It was a force, a reminder. They said the cat roamed the icy hills and peered into windows, searching for those who hadn't received new clothes for Christmas. Those who were lazy, who hadn't finished their winter work, would find themselves unprotected, and the Yule Cat would devour them whole. Children shivered at the tale, but their parents told it with love. Because the story wasn't really about punishment, it was about survival. You see, the Yule Cat was a symbol of work and generosity. In the old days, Icelandic winters were cruel. Families wove wool to keep each other warm. If you worked hard and finished your spinning, you'd have new clothes by Christmas. A small proof that you'd done your part. If you didn't, it meant you'd left your people vulnerable to the cold. And so the story warned, finish your work, take care of each other, or the Yule Cat will come for you. But here's the twist. If you were generous, if you gave clothes to those who had none, the Yule Cat would leave you alone. Because even monsters, it seemed, respected kindness. So every winter, families shared what they had. A scarf, a mitten, a piece of cloth, simple gifts but powerful charms against the cold. And when they wrapped themselves in their new wool on Christmas Eve, they'd smile and whisper, "The cat will not get us tonight." The Yule Cat became more than a story. It became a lesson. That the warmth we create for others keeps the darkness at bay. And in the coldest corners of the world, that might be the only magic that matters. But the Yule Cat wasn't the only spirit roaming those nights. In the same icy valleys lived 13 brothers, strange, playful, and endlessly mischievous. They were called the Yule Lads. They weren't evil, just chaotic. Each one arrived on a different night before Christmas, and each one had a peculiar habit that made him famous. There was Spoon Licker, who crept into kitchens and licked every wooden spoon clean. Door Slammer, who waited until midnight to slam every door in the house. Sausage Swiper, who stole meats drying above the hearth. And Candle Stealer, who took children's candles, leaving them in the dark. 13 nights, 13 brothers. Each caused a little trouble, then vanished back into the snow. The villagers didn't hate them. In fact, they left food out for them. Because as with all winter spirits, respect was the key. Each night, children placed bowls of porridge by the window. If the Yule Lad liked it, he'd leave a gift, a small toy or a sweet. If he didn't, he'd leave a potato. And so, through laughter and fear, mischief and generosity, the Yule Lads became symbols of joy during the hardest time of year. They were the bridge between fear and fun, a way to remind children that the dark wasn't only dangerous, it could also be alive. Every creak of the house, every whisper in the wind, every misplaced spoon, a sign that something magical had passed through. And when the 13th night came, they all vanished. Back to the mountains, back to their cave until next winter's laughter. Farther east and north, in the snowbound farms of Scandinavia, people told stories of tiny beings who watched over the home. The Tomt in Sweden, the Nisse in Norway and Denmark. They were small, no taller than a child, with long beards, red caps, and eyes that glowed like embers. They lived in barns, under floorboards, or behind old doors, watching over the animals, the crops, and the fire. If treated well, they brought luck. They made sure the cows gave milk, the wheat grew tall, and no one fell ill in winter. But if forgotten, if someone mocked them, or failed to leave their bowl of porridge, they could turn vengeful. Inisa might tangle a horse's mane into knots. A Tomt might hide your tools, or whisper your name through the rafters until you couldn't sleep. Still, people loved them, because they weren't gods or demons, they were family. The old stories said every home had one, and that they stayed as long as the hearth stayed warm. So on Christmas Eve, when the family gathered to eat, a bowl of porridge with butter was always left on the doorstep. No one dared forget. Because if you pleased your Tomt, your house would stay blessed for another year. These spirits, the cat, the lads, the Nisse, each carried a fragment of an older world, a world where kindness, work, and respect weren't just virtues. They were spells that kept you alive. In a land where night could last 20 hours and the cold could steal breath itself, these stories gave people something to believe in, that as long as they respected the old ways, light would return. And maybe that's the thread that ties them all together. The Yule Cat's hunger, the Yule Lad's laughter, the Nisa's quiet watch, each, in their own way, reminded people to care, to finish their work, to share their warmth, to leave a light burning for the unseen. Because in the flicker of candlelight, when the dark pressed close to the windows, stories were more than entertainment. They were protection. Every whispered name, every song, every bowl of porridge, a way to keep the cold things at peace. And when the wind dies, when the last ember dims, you can almost hear them still. Paws in the snow, laughter on the roof, a tiny knock at the door. They're still out there. Not to harm, but to remind that in every winter, no matter how long or dark, there's magic waiting, as long as we keep the fire alive. The night deepens, the western fires fade, and far beyond the mountains, across frozen plains and dark forests, winter takes another shape. In the east they did not fear the cold, they spoke to it. They left bread on the windowsills for the frost, and whispered into the dark as though the wind itself could hear them. Because here, in Russia, in Poland, in the old Carpathian villages, winter was not a season. It was a presence, a living thing, one that watched and remembered. The people called him Morosko, the father of frost. Some said he was a god, others a spirit, but all agreed he was ancient, powerful, and mercilessly fair. He wore a cloak of white snow and blue crystal. His beard was long and silver, his breath freezing air into diamonds. When he walked, the ground hardened under his feet, and rivers turned to mirrors of ice. Yet Morosko was not evil. He was the cold itself, unfeeling, but never unjust. And in his story lies one of the oldest lessons of winter. Kindness warms even the frost. They told of a young girl, poor, kind, and cast out by her cruel stepmother. One night in the dead of winter, she was sent into the woods to die. She wore nothing but rags and carried no fire. As she sat beneath the trees, she heard the snow crackle, and a deep voice spoke from the shadows. "Maiden, do you feel warm?" Her lips trembled, but she smiled. "Yes, Father Frost," she said softly. "Thank you for your kindness." The cold deepened. The wind turned sharp. "And now?" asked the voice again. Her fingers were numb, her breath nearly gone, but she whispered, "Still warm, kind Father Frost." Morosko stepped forward, tall, radiant, terrible. He looked into her heart and saw no bitterness, no hatred, only grace. So he wrapped her in a cloak of furs and laid beside her a chest filled with gold. By morning, when the villagers found her, she was alive, glowing as if touched by sunlight. And so, they said, Morosko blessed the good-hearted and froze the cruel. He was the balance of winter, not punishment, but truth. If you were cold within, he made you colder. If you carried warmth, he made you brighter. And that is how people learned to greet him. When frost formed on their windows, they'd whisper, "Zdravstvуй, Morosko." Good evening, Father Frost. Not as a prayer, not as fear, but as respect. Because even the harshest winter, they said, can be kind if you greet it with warmth. But if Morosko ruled the frost, then Marzana ruled what came after. She was the goddess of death and rebirth, the one who guided winter to its end. Her story belonged to Poland, Bohemia, and the Carpathians, to villages where the snow was deep and spring could take months to return. She was beautiful and terrifying, her hair like river reeds, her skin pale as ash. Some said her eyes were made of frozen water, and that when she wept, the ice melted into spring rivers. Each year, as the snows began to melt, the people would build her an effigy, a figure made of straw and cloth, dressed in rags, sometimes adorned with beads or dried flowers. They called it Marzana's body. The whole village would gather, singing as they carried her through the streets. Drums would beat, children would shout, and the air would ring with the sound of release. Because this wasn't mourning, it was celebration. They were walking death out of their world. At the riverbank they would stop. With a final song they'd set her aflame, then cast her into the icy water. The straw would hiss, the smoke would rise, and the current would carry her away. They'd watch her vanish downstream, her burning reflection flickering against the last of the winter ice. And then they'd turn and walk home, singing the song of rebirth. Marzana swims away, and life returns again. It was a ritual older than memory, a way to remind themselves that nothing, not even death, lasts forever. Marzana wasn't feared. She was understood. She was the part of nature that made way for life to bloom again. And every time the people threw her into the river, they weren't destroying her. They were releasing her, so she could return next year. Because death, they believed, was just another form of sleep. But there was one spirit who never left, one who didn't wait for festivals and didn't bless or punish. She simply wandered. They called her Zimna Pani, the Cold Lady. No one knew where she came from. Some said she was the ghost of a woman lost in a snowstorm. Others believed she was the frost itself, the whisper that moved between worlds. They said she appeared at the height of blizzards, a faint shape in the white, a woman's outline moving against the wind. If you looked too long, she'd vanish, but if you ignored her, she'd follow you home. Her presence brought silence, the kind of silence that makes the air heavy, where even fire seems afraid to crackle. And sometimes, people said, they'd wake at night to see frost creeping across their windows, forming the shape of a hand. Zimna Pani had passed by, but she wasn't cruel. She was lonely. They said she looked for warmth, for songs, for laughter, for homes that still remembered her name. So when people heard the wind howling, they'd throw another log on the fire, sit close together and tell her stories. "Don't cry, cold lady," they'd whisper. "You are welcome by our fire." And in that way, they gave her what she wanted most. Not worship, but remembrance. Zimna Pani became the spirit of empathy, a reminder that even the coldest souls once sought warmth. And so, through their stories, the people of the East learned the same lesson as the people of the West, that the frost, the dark, and the silence were never enemies. They were keepers of memory. In the end, all these stories, Morosko with his icy justice, Marzana with her fiery farewell, Zimna Pani with her quiet longing, speak of one truth. Winter is not cruel. It simply remembers. It remembers the warmth you gave, the kindness you shared, the light you carried, and in remembering, it waits for you to do the same. Because that's what winter teaches best. Not to fear the dark, but to fill it with warmth. Not to hide from the cold, but to understand its beauty. When the last snow melts, and spring returns to the valleys, the people don't forget these spirits. They whisper their names one last time, as if saying goodbye to old friends. Sleep now, Morozko. Rest well, Marzani. Be warm, Zimnapani. And for one final moment, the air holds still, as though winter itself is listening. Then it exhales, and so the frost retreats. The rivers move again, the sun returns, and another year begins, a cycle older than memory, sacred in its silence. Winter ends not in death, but in remembrance. The night is almost over. The wind still breathes, but softer now, no longer a howl but a sigh. The frost still glitters, but it's thinner on the windows. And for the first time in months, the horizon begins to blush. This is the return of light. In the north, where the sun disappears for weeks, people once waited for this very moment. The first day when light lingered a little longer, when the stars seemed less lonely, when morning returned like an old friend. They didn't know the science of it. They didn't need to. They could feel it. The earth turning toward life again, the warmth waking under the snow. They said the gods themselves exhaled when dawn came back, and so did the people. Every story you've heard tonight, the Yule fires, the spirits and saints, the gods of frost and the beasts of snow, was born from this longing, the longing for light. For thousands of years humans have feared the dark, not because it was evil, but because it made us remember how fragile warmth is. And every winter we had to fight to earn it back. We made fires to mimic the sun. We told stories to mimic hope. And in doing so we created something sacred. A season of stillness that ends in joy. As Christianity spread across the frozen lands, it didn't erase the old ways. It simply blended with them, like dawn blending into night. The pagan fires of Yule became candles in the chapel. The evergreens once hung for Odin became symbols of everlasting life. And the birth of Christ became the new promise, that even in the coldest heart of the world, light returns. The villagers still lit their hearths at midnight, still gathered in silence, still whispered blessings for the coming year. But now their prayers had two names, one old, one new. They spoke of the sun and the sun, and maybe they were the same thing all along. Because whether you believed in Christ or in the cycles of nature or simply in the kindness of your neighbour, the meaning was the same. The light always comes back. Somewhere in the forest, the Yule logs burned their last embers. The Perchton parades had ended. Their masks hung in silence. Krampus returned to the mountains. Perchta walked back into the mist. The Yule Cat curled into its den, full and drowsy. The Nissa swept the barns one last time before sleep. And the people, they rested too. They rested knowing they'd made it through another winter. They'd honoured the old ways, welcomed the new ones, and carried the fire forward, just as their ancestors had. When the bells of dawn began to ring across the snow, the sound wasn't just celebration, it was memory, a bridge between centuries, the echo of voices, Roman, Norse, Slavic, Celtic, all whispering the same promise. The light returns, the dark is done. In little wooden chapels and moss-covered shrines, people lit candles for the new year. In the woods, the snow began to fall softly again, each flake catching the first gold of sunrise. The fires of Yule faded into the glow of Christmas morning, and for a moment the world was perfectly balanced. Light and dark, fear and faith, ancient and new. Each one folded into the other like pages in the same storybook. In every village they told their children, that if you listen closely you can still hear the old ones walking in the wind, the ones who kept the fires burning before us, the ones who whispered to the frost and fed the spirits. They said you can hear them between the bells, a low hum, a breath, a sound that says, keep the warmth, pass it on. Because that's the heart of it all. The light doesn't win over darkness, it grows from it. Every ending becomes a beginning. Every shadow gives birth to flame. The old gods, the saints, the stories. They were all telling us the same thing. The cycle never ends. And now, as the snow melts from the eaves and the morning bells ring over the valleys, you can imagine them. All those spirits you met tonight, walking back into sleep. Krampus, smiling faintly as his chains fade away. Perchta turning her face toward the light. The Yule Cat curling into a ball of shadow and purr. Father Frost tipping his icy crown to the sunrise. And the cold lady, Zimnapani, finally warming her hands by a window somewhere in heaven. And you sit by your own fire. The world quiet. The story's finished. Outside, the wind stirs the last snowflakes. They drift, slow and graceful, like ancient words carried on the air. And you remember, these tales were never just about monsters or gods. They were about us, about how we endure, how we hope, how we carry light forward, even in the longest night. They don't want to scare you. They just want to be remembered. Close your eyes, listen, breathe, and sleep well. The fire is still burning, the light has returned, and you are warm.